In 1929, the world changed in 4 days. That's how long it took for the American economy to collapse and drag millions of lives down with it. Within 3 years, 1 in 4 workers had nothing. No job, no income, no safety net. Men left home not because they wanted to, but because staying meant one more mouth a struggling family couldn't feed. They rode freight cars into the unknown, built fires beside the tracks, shared what little they had and somehow made it enough. Back home, wives and mothers faced the same battle at cold kitchen stoves and nearly empty cupboards. This is what they made: 30 meals. 30 quiet acts of refusing to disappear. Number 30. Mulligan stew. Every man brought something. That was the rule in the hobo jungle camps that sprang up at the edges of rail yards from Chicago to Los Angeles during the early 1930s. One man had a potato. Another had a fistful of dried beans he'd been carrying in his coat pocket for 2 days. A third had half an onion and a small piece of fatback wrapped in newspaper. They pooled it. They boiled it. They called it Mulligan stew. This was not charity. This was not begging. This was collective intelligence, the understanding that 10 men with almost nothing could eat better together than alone. Number 29. Bread and lard. 3 cents a pound. That's what lard cost in 1932. A thick slice of yesterday's bread, a knife pulled across cold white lard, a pinch of salt pressed into it with a thumb. That was supper in the tenements of Chicago's South Side, in the row houses of Pittsburgh's steel districts, in the cold water flats of the Lower East Side. They called it poor food. They were wrong. Lard contains more oleic acid, the same heart-healthy fat found in olive oil, than almost any modern butter substitute. Grandma just called it bread and lard. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 28. Fried water gravy. Bacon grease left in the pan. A spoonful of flour stirred in over heat until it went the color of weak coffee. Water poured in slow, whisked until it thickened. Salt. Sometimes a crack of black pepper. That was fried water gravy. Rural South. Appalachia. 1930s. Under 1 cent per serving. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Every culinary school in America now teaches a version of this and calls it a pan sauce. They charge $40 for the plate underneath it. The technique is identical. The ingredients are nearly identical. Nothing changed except who was allowed to call it cooking. Number 27. Dandelion green salad with bacon fat dressing. Every spring, across farm communities in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, women walked the fields before breakfast with a knife and a basket. They weren't foraging. They were shopping. Dandelion greens pulled from the ground before they flowered, dressed with warm bacon fat, a pour of cider vinegar, and a pinch of sugar. Served wilted and sharp and alive on the plate. Free. Completely free. Dandelion greens contain more beta-carotene than carrots, more calcium per serving than milk, more iron than spinach. In the 1930s, farm families who couldn't afford vegetables at any price were eating one of the most nutritionally dense plants in North America, and they didn't know it because they didn't need to know it. It worked. Number 26. Hobo eggs. 1 egg, 1 heel of bread, 1 fire. That was the entire equation in the rail camps of the early Depression. A hole torn from the center of the bread, the whole thing laid flat in a greased pan over a campfire, the egg cracked directly into the hole and cooked until the white set firm and the yolk stayed soft. 18 cents bought a dozen eggs in 1930. 18 cents fed 12 men breakfast, 1 egg each, 1 piece of bread each, nothing wasted, nobody hungry. They called it hobo eggs. Some called it eggs in a nest. Whatever name you knew it by, it fed a grown working man from a single flame and 2 ingredients. Number 25. Cornmeal mush. In the sharecropper cabins of the Mississippi Delta and the Black Belt counties of Alabama, cornmeal mush was not a side dish, it was the meal. It was sometimes the only meal. 2 cents bought a pound of cornmeal in 1933. A pound of cornmeal made enough mush to feed a family of 5 for 2 days, morning and evening, poured hot into bowls, eaten with whatever fat existed in the house, sometimes with molasses, sometimes with nothing at all. Today we call it polenta. We serve it in white ceramic bowls in dimly lit restaurants in Lower Manhattan and charge $14 a plate. We drizzle truffle oil over it. We call it rustic. It is rustic. It is also the food that kept entire communities alive when nothing else existed. That is not the same thing as a dinner trend. Number 24. Salt, pork, and beans. 5 cents a pound for salt pork, 3 cents a pound for dried navy beans. 20 cents total fed a family of 6 for 2 full days in 1931. That math doesn't work anywhere in a modern grocery store. It doesn't work because it was never supposed to work again. Salt pork cut into cubes and rendered down, dried beans soaked overnight and simmered for hours until they turned creamy and soft, the whole pot seasoned with whatever onion and pepper existed in the house. It was protein, it was fiber, it was warmth and fullness and enough. Coal mining families in West Virginia made this every Monday. Sharecropper families in Georgia made it every Friday. It crossed every regional line because hunger didn't recognize borders. Number 23. Potato soup. 3 ingredients: potato, water, salt. That was Depression potato soup in the farmhouses of Dust Bowl, Oklahoma, and southwestern Kansas, where the topsoil had blown away and the crops had failed 3 years running, and the only thing still growing was what was already in the root cellar. Potatoes diced and boiled until they fell apart into the water, thickening it naturally, the whole pot seasoned with salt and sometimes a pour of canned milk if it existed. Eaten for dinner, the leftovers eaten for breakfast. Sometimes a third meal stretched from the bottom of the pot. 2 cents a pound. A pot of potato soup cost 12 cents and lasted 3 days. The simplicity was not a limitation. The simplicity was the engineering. Number 22. Crackers and milk. 9 cents for a box of saltines. A pour of whatever milk was left in the house. A bowl, a spoon, and a child sitting at a kitchen table at 7 in the evening in a city apartment where the electricity had been shut off 2 weeks ago. That was supper in thousands of American homes in the early 1930s. Not a snack, supper. Mothers didn't apologize for it. They couldn't afford to. They set the bowl down and they sat across from their children and they watched them eat, and they did not say that this was not enough because saying it would have made it true in a way that silence prevented calcium. Carbohydrate. Enough. The children grew. They grew because their mothers refused to believe otherwise. Number 21. Hobo jungle coffee. The grounds never got thrown away. In the rail camps of the 1930s, coffee grounds were used 4, sometimes 5 times before they gave up the last trace of color and flavor. Chicory root dried and roasted was added to stretch what remained. Water boiled in a tin can over a wood fire, grounds dropped in loose, the whole thing settled by cracking a cold egg into it to drag the grounds to the bottom. Today, Café du Monde in New Orleans sells chicory coffee for $4 a cup and calls it a Louisiana tradition. It is a Louisiana tradition. It is also what men with nothing figured out when real coffee ran short, and the mornings were cold and the freight car didn't leave until dawn. Number 20. Fried salt pork with milk gravy. Eastern Kentucky. West Virginia. 1,932. A coal miner going into a shaft at 5 in the morning needed calories the way a machine needs fuel, not as a preference, but as a mechanical requirement. His wife understood this without being told. Salt pork sliced thin and fried until it crisped in its own fat. The drippings left in the pan, flour stirred in, canned milk poured slow until it thickened into a gravy the color of cream. Poured over biscuits or cornbread or whatever bread existed. The whole meal under 8 cents. A man doing 12 hours of physical labor underground ate this before dawn and came back up alive. The caloric density was not accidental. It was calculated by women who had no margin for error and made none. Number 19. Tomato gravy over biscuits. A can of tomatoes cost 10 cents in 1933. 2 pounds of flour cost 9 cents. From those two things, a southern farm wife in Georgia or Tennessee or Alabama made a breakfast that fed 5 people and still had something left for the neighbor who came to the door. Bacon drippings heated in the pan, flour stirred in until it toasted, canned tomatoes poured in whole and broken up with a spoon, seasoned with salt and black pepper until it reduced into something thick and red and sharp and deeply savory. Poured over split biscuits, acid, fat, salt, starch. Every brunch restaurant in America is still trying to build that flavor combination from scratch and charging $16 for the attempt. This was the original. This was breakfast. This cost 15 cents for a family of 5. Number 18. Bean bread. 500 years before the Depression, Cherokee families in the mountains of eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina were making bean bread, dried beans cooked soft and folded into cornmeal dough, wrapped in corn husks and boiled until firm. By the 1930s, it had moved into Appalachian farmhouse kitchens and become part of the White Mountain cooking tradition without anyone pausing to acknowledge where it came from. Under 3 cents per loaf, dense, filling, high in protein and complex carbohydrate. A food with a half-millennium of refinement behind it, perfected long before European settlers arrived, absorbed into poverty cooking, and then forgotten entirely when prosperity told everyone to want something different. This was not fusion cuisine. This was not a recipe experiment. This was knowledge, ancient, specific, correct knowledge that we discarded. Number 17. Stewed tomatoes and bread. Italian grandmothers in the tenements of New York's Lower East Side called it pane e pomodoro bread and tomatoes. Eastern European grandmothers in Chicago called it something in Polish or Yiddish that translated the same way. Tomatoes stewed down in their own juice with garlic and olive oil, when olive oil existed, without it, when it didn't poured hot over thick slices of yesterday's bread, until the bread absorbed everything and became something entirely new. Under 5 cents per family serving in 1934. Every rustic tomato bread on every Italian restaurant menu in America today traces directly back to this dish. The restaurants charge $18. They describe it as a peasant tradition. They are correct. They have simply forgotten or chosen to forget which peasants and why. Number 16. Hobo rice pudding. A tin can. A handful of rice. A pour of water. A spoonful of sugar. A wood fire at the edge of a rail yard somewhere in Mississippi or Louisiana, where the southern roots ran warm even in winter. Rice pudding made in a tin can over an open fire cost 3 cents in 1933. The rice swelled and softened in the sweet water until it thickened into something warm and genuine and almost luxurious against the cold. Today it appears on dessert menus in southern restaurants at $11 a portion, described as a classic comfort dish. It is a classic comfort dish. It is also what a man with 3 cents and a tin can made when he needed to remind himself that beauty was still available to him. Number 15. Head cheese. The pig's head was the last thing anyone wanted to buy, which is exactly why it was the first thing that poor families and immigrant communities sought out. German butchers in Milwaukee, Polish families in Cleveland, Slovak communities in Pittsburgh. They took the pig's head, cleaned it, boiled it for hours until the meat fell from the bone, packed it into a mold with its own gelatin, and seasoned it with vinegar, black pepper, and bay leaf. Sliced cold, eaten on bread. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Nose-to-tail eating was not a food trend invented by Brooklyn restaurants in 2008. It was how every culture on Earth ate for 10,000 years before the meatpacking industry decided which parts of the animal were acceptable and charged you a premium for the rest. Sometime between 1945 and 1960, a decision was made about what American food should look like. It wasn't made by grandmothers. It wasn't made by the people who had spent the Depression learning how to feed families on 14 cents a day. It was made in boardrooms by companies that needed to sell product. And the most effective way to sell product was to make people ashamed of what they already had. Crisco launched its first major marketing campaign in 1911, explicitly positioning itself as cleaner, more modern, and more refined than lard. By the 1950s, that campaign had succeeded completely. Lard, the fat that had sustained American families for 3 centuries, had been repositioned in the public imagination as poverty food, embarrassing food, food you didn't serve when company came. General Mills, Campbell's, Kraft, and Birdseye spent billions of dollars between 1945 and 1970 associating canned and processed convenience food with prosperity and homemade Depression-era food with failure and backwardness. It worked. The grandmothers stopped teaching because their daughters stopped asking because asking felt like asking to go backward. In 2001, a Harvard research team published findings confirming that the industrial trans fats in the shortenings and margarines that had replaced lard were directly and causally linked to cardiovascular disease. The modern substitute was killing people. The food it replaced was not. That is not progress. That is a decades-long corporate campaign that cost American families their food heritage and cost some of them their lives. Number 14. Oatmeal with lard and salt. Not sweet, not sugared, not topped with brown sugar and dried cranberries and served in a mason jar. Savory. Eaten with a spoon of lard stirred in and a pinch of salt pressed on top the way Scottish and Irish immigrant families in New England and the Great Lakes states had eaten oats for 300 years before they arrived in America, and continued eating them through the Depression because it was what they knew and what worked. 5 cents bought a pound of oatmeal in 1931. A pound made breakfast for a family of 4 for 4 days. It was slow-burning, complex carbohydrate that kept a working man warm and functional until midday. The American cereal industry spent the entire 20th century training the public to want oats sweet and processed and sold in a cardboard box. Before that campaign, oats were just food. Honest, complete, correct food. Number 13. Pot liquor soup. The pot was never empty. Collard greens had been cooking down for 2 hours in a pot with a piece of fatback and a handful of black pepper, and what remained in the bottom when the greens were served wasn't broth. It was something darker and silkier than broth, the color of strong tea left too long on the stove. Rich with everything the greens had given up during cooking. In the rural South Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, this liquid was ladled into bowls and eaten with cornbread crumbled on top. In the 1930s, researchers at Tuskegee University documented what the grandmothers already knew. Every vitamin and mineral the collard greens released during cooking iron, calcium, folate, vitamin K ended up concentrated in that liquid. They knew things about nutrition that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Grandma just called it not wasting good food. Number 12. Hobo steak. Bologna. 6 to 8 cents a pound in the 1930s. Sliced thick, laid into a cast iron pan with a spoonful of lard, fried over high heat until the edges curled up and blackened and the center went dense and brown. They called it poor man's steak. In the working-class neighborhoods of Cincinnati and Louisville and Memphis, it was Friday night supper. In the rail camps of the Midwest, It was the closest thing to a celebration meal a man with 8 cents could produce. It is still made in West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. Today, one of the very few Depression-era meals that survived the post-war prosperity purge with its name and its dignity intact. One of the few that didn't get renamed and repositioned and charged back to the people it came from at 10 times the price. Number 11. Drippings on toast. Every pan that cooked meat left something behind. The fat, the brown bits, the rendered residue of whatever protein had passed through the kitchen that week, pork, chicken, sometimes beef, often just fatback. It cooled in the pan and solidified into drippings, dark, salty, intensely flavored. British immigrant families in the industrial cities called it bread and drip. In the New York tenements, it had no name. It was simply what you did with the pan after you cooked, what you spread on yesterday's bread when there was nothing else, what you ate standing at the counter at 11 at night when the children were in bed and the stove was still warm. Today, it is called bone marrow toast. It is served on a wooden board in Brooklyn restaurants for $18. The flavor is identical. The people who invented it never saw a dime. Number 10. Vinegar pie. When there were no lemons, and in the farmhouses of Appalachia and the Ozarks and the rural Midwest in the 1930s, there were almost never lemons. Farm women made a pie that tasted of lemon anyway. Apple cider vinegar, eggs, sugar, a lard crust, beaten together and poured into a shell and baked until the custard set firm and golden. The acid in the vinegar behaves in the mouth identically to citrus acid. The chemistry is exact, not approximate, exact. These women were not improvising. They understood what they were doing at a molecular level without ever having taken a chemistry class, because decades of practice had taught them what worked and what didn't. Under 8 cents for an entire pie. A farmhouse full of children got dessert. No lemons required, no apology necessary. Number 10. Ghost bacon egg sandwich. There was no bacon, not today, but there was the grease, dark and smoky in the tin beside the stove, carrying the memory of every strip of bacon that had ever been cooked in that kitchen. You put a spoonful of it in the skillet. You cracked one egg into it. You let it cook until the whites set and the edges went brown and lacy in the grease. One egg on white bread with the grease. That was the whole sandwich. On farms across the Midwest and the rural South throughout the 1930s, eggs were the last protein that disappeared even in the worst times because the chickens were still in the yard. The grease was always there. The bread was always there. This sandwich was made 10,000 times a day across this country in kitchens that smelled of iron and wood smoke and mornings that started before light. Number 9. Onion gravy sandwich. You sliced 3 onions thin and put them in a pan with lard over low heat, and you let them go. 20 minutes, 30, until they were the color of copper and the kitchen smelled like something sacred. Then you added a handful of flour, a cup of water or weak broth, salt, black pepper, and you stirred until it thickened into something dark and glossy and deeply, deeply savory. You ladled it over day-old bread in a bowl, or if there was no bowl to spare, you pressed the bread flat and folded it around the gravy and ate it standing at the stove. In French, Creole households in Louisiana, and in working-class kitchens across Illinois and Missouri in the 1930s and 40s, the onion gravy sandwich was Monday's meal built from the onions in the root cellar and the lard in the tin and nothing else. This is not a sloppy Joe. This is something older than that, and better, and it cost almost nothing to make. Number 8. Vinegar greens on cornbread. Turnip greens cooked down soft in a pot with a piece of fatback, then drained and dressed with apple cider vinegar and a pinch of sugar. Pressed between 2 pieces of cold cornbread and eaten like a sandwich when there was no bowl to spare or when you were eating in the field. In rural North Carolina and across the Carolina Piedmont through the 1930s, this was harvest food made during tobacco and cotton season when women cooked ahead and children carried lunch to the fields in cloth tied at the corners. The vinegar did two things. It cut the bitterness of the greens and it preserved them slightly, kept them edible in summer heat longer than anything else would have. That was not a recipe trick. That was chemistry understood in the body before it was ever understood in a laboratory. Anchor point 2. Here is the part that should make you genuinely angry. In 2019, the National Institutes of Health published findings on dietary fat composition and cardiovascular health that quietly reversed 40 years of official nutritional guidance. Lard, the fat that appears in sandwich after sandwich on this list, the fat that a generation of advertising told Americans was deadly, was found to have a more favorable fatty acid profile than the partially hydrogenated vegetable oils that replaced it. The vegetable shortening industry, Crisco, introduced by Procter & Gamble in 1911, marketed specifically as a modern, scientific, American alternative to the animal fats that immigrant and working-class families had been using for centuries. By 1950, Crisco had replaced lard in most American kitchens. By 1960, the trans fat content of the American diet had increased by 400%. Heart disease rates climbed throughout the same period. The women who spread lard on bread in 1933 were not doing something primitive. They were working with a fat their bodies recognized, a fat with a smoke point suitable for frying, a fat that carried fat-soluble vitamins, a fat that had sustained human populations for thousands of years, and the peanut butter thinned with bacon grease, the dripping spread cold on Monday bread, the crackling rendered from the hog, the watercress gathered free from the creek bank. Every one of those choices, made out of poverty and necessity, turns out to align with what nutritional science is now slowly, quietly admitting it got wrong for 70 years. They knew things about fat and fermentation and whole grains and foraged food that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 7. Sorghum and butter sandwich. Not molasses, not honey. Sorghum pressed from the tall cane grown in rows behind the house, boiled down in a cast-iron kettle in October, poured into jars that lasted all winter. Dark and complex and slightly bitter at the edge, the way nothing that comes from a factory ever is. You split a biscuit while it was still warm. You put a pat of hand-churned butter on each half and watched it melt into the interior. Then you poured sorghum over it slow and let it pool in the butter. In the Ozarks of Arkansas and Missouri, and in the hill country of Tennessee and Kentucky, this was not dessert. This was breakfast. This was the sandwich a child carried to school in the Cookeville Hills in 1938 and did not apologize for. Sorghum contains iron, calcium, and antioxidants at levels that refined sugar cannot touch. The grandmothers of the Ozarks didn't know that word antioxidant, but they knew which children were healthy and which ones weren't, and they kept making the sorghum. Number 6. Salt pork and biscuit. Salt pork, the fatty, heavily brined cut from the belly or side of the hog, the cut that cost almost nothing because it was nearly all fat and salt fried hard in a dry skillet until it was crisp on the outside and rendered on the inside, pulled from the pan and pressed between the halves of a fresh biscuit. In the Mississippi Delta and the Arkansas Delta, and in the mountain counties of Appalachia, this was fast food. Made in 15 minutes, eaten in 5. A piece of salt pork cost 3 cents in 1934. A biscuit cost less than a penny in ingredients when you made them yourself, which everyone did. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The salt pork biscuit sandwich preceded the fast food breakfast sandwich by 40 years, fed harder working people more effectively, and cost 1% of what a drive-thru charges for its version today. Number 5. Cheese heel sandwich. End of the week. End of the loaf. The heel of the bread, the piece nobody preferred, rubbed on both cut sides with a raw clove of garlic, then pressed around whatever cheese scraps remained. In Italian households in Brooklyn and the Bronx in the 1920s and 30s, cheese scraps meant the rind of a Romano or Parmesan too hard to grate but not too hard to soften against warm bread, or a few thin slices of provolone from the bottom of the paper. You pressed it. You sometimes warmed it briefly on the stovetop. The garlic soaked into the crumb. Today, in the wine bars of Lower Manhattan, they serve aged cheese on grilled sourdough with garlic oil for $7 a plate. They have reconstructed, without knowing it, what the women of those tenement buildings made on Friday evenings with the things that were left. Grandma just called it cleaning out the icebox. Number 4. Cold bean and bread fold, prairie sandwich. Cold baked beans, navy beans, slow cooked all day Saturday with a piece of salt pork and a spoonful of molasses spooned onto a slice of bread and folded over once with one hand. No plate required. No second slice of bread required. On the homestead farms of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Oklahoma Territory from the 1880s through the 1930s, this was called a ranger fold by some, and nothing at all by others because it didn't need a name. You made baked beans on Saturday, and you ate them hot for supper and cold for the next 3 days in every form available. Cowboys working the cattle drives of the same era knew this same fold beans on bread, one hand, on horseback if the moment required it. It was not a recipe. It was just how you ate when the work didn't stop and the food was already made. Number 3. Liverwurst and raw onion on rye. Liverwurst, Leberwurst in the German original, a soft, spreadable sausage made from pork liver and fat and spice, pressed into a casing, eaten cold spread, thick on a slice of dark rye bread with a sharp smear of mustard and 3 thin rings of raw white onion. In the German and Eastern European immigrant neighborhoods of Chicago, Milwaukee, and Cincinnati through the 1920s and 32nds, this was the sandwich that working men carried to the stockyards and the tanneries and the machine shops. It was organ meat. It was the part of the animal that the wealthy did not want and the immigrant family could afford. A quarter pound of liverwurst cost 6 cents in 1932. It is the most nutritionally dense sandwich on this entire list. Pork liver contains more iron than any cut of muscle meat, more B12 than almost any other food, more folate than a cup of spinach. The men who ate this sandwich 5 days a week in the Chicago stockyards were not eating poorly. They were eating better than most Americans eat today. Number 25. Cornmeal mush. In the sharecropper cabins of the Mississippi Delta and the Black Belt counties of Alabama, cornmeal mush was not a side dish. It was the meal. It was sometimes the only meal. 2 cents bought a pound of cornmeal in 1933. A pound of cornmeal made enough mush to feed a family of 5 for 2 days, morning and evening, poured hot into bowls, eaten with whatever fat existed in the house, sometimes with molasses, sometimes with nothing at all. Today we call it polenta. We serve it in white ceramic bowls in dimly lit restaurants in Lower Manhattan and charge $14 a plate. We drizzle truffle oil over it. We call it rustic. It is rustic. It is also the food that kept entire communities alive when nothing else existed. That is not the same thing as a dinner trend. Number 24. Salt, pork, and beans. 5 cents a pound for salt pork. 3 cents a pound for dried navy beans. 20 cents total fed a family of 6 for 2 full days in 1931. That math doesn't work anywhere in a modern grocery store. It doesn't work because it was never supposed to work again. Salt pork cut into cubes and rendered down, dried beans soaked overnight and simmered for hours until they turned creamy and soft, the whole pot seasoned with whatever onion and pepper existed in the house. It was protein, it was fiber, it was warmth and fullness and enough. Coal mining families in West Virginia made this every Monday. Sharecropper families in Georgia made it every Friday. It crossed every regional line because hunger didn't recognize borders. Number 23, potato soup. 3 ingredients: potato, water, salt. That was Depression potato soup in the farmhouses of Dust Bowl, Oklahoma, and southwestern Kansas, where the topsoil had blown away and the crops had failed 3 years running, and the only thing still growing was what was already in the root cellar. Potatoes diced and boiled until they fell apart into the water, thickening it naturally, the whole pot seasoned with salt and sometimes a pour of canned milk if it existed. Eaten for dinner, the leftovers eaten for breakfast. Sometimes a third meal stretched from the bottom of the pot. 2 cents a pound. A pot of potato soup cost 12 cents and lasted 3 days. The simplicity was not a limitation. The simplicity was the engineering. Number 22. Crackers and milk. 9 cents for a box of saltines. A pour of whatever milk was left in the house. A bowl, a spoon, and a child sitting at a kitchen table at 7 in the evening in a city apartment where the electricity had been shut off 2 weeks ago. That was supper in thousands of American homes in the early 1930s. Not a snack, supper. Mothers didn't apologize for it. They couldn't afford to. They set the bowl down and they sat across from their children and they watched them eat, and they did not say that this was not enough, because saying it would have made it true in a way that silence prevented calcium. Carbohydrate. Enough. The children grew. They grew because their mothers refused to believe otherwise. Number 21. Hobo jungle coffee. The grounds never got thrown away. In the rail camps of the 1930s, coffee grounds were used 4, sometimes 5 times before they gave up the last trace of color and flavor. Chicory root, dried and roasted, was added to stretch what remained. Water boiled in a tin can over a wood fire, grounds dropped in loose, the whole thing settled by cracking a cold egg into it to drag the grounds to the bottom. Today, Café du Monde in New Orleans sells chicory coffee for $4 a cup and calls it a Louisiana tradition. It is a Louisiana tradition. It is also what men with nothing figured out when real coffee ran short, and the mornings were cold and the freight car didn't leave until dawn. Number 20. Fried salt pork with milk gravy. Eastern Kentucky. West Virginia. 1,932. A coal miner going into a shaft at 5 in the morning needed calories the way a machine needs fuel, not as a preference, but as a mechanical requirement. His wife understood this without being told. Salt pork sliced thin and fried until it crisped in its own fat. The drippings left in the pan, flour stirred in, canned milk poured slow until it thickened into a gravy the color of cream. Poured over biscuits or cornbread or whatever bread existed, the whole meal under 8 cents. A man doing 12 hours of physical labor underground ate this before dawn and came back up alive. The caloric density was not accidental. It was calculated by women who had no margin for error and made none.